December 18, 1944. Dawn light rippled across the Philippine Sea as FM-2 Wildcats from Composite Squadron VC-13 circled above the small escort carrier USS Core. The air smelled of hot engine oil and salt spray rising from the wind-cut water below. Lieutenant Howard Sargent steadied his Wildcat at 3,000 feet, feeling the vibration of the Wright R-1820 engine through the seat as he scanned the pale horizon. The carrier group moved slowly, too slowly for comfort, its steel deck glinting beneath scattered cloud shadows, while the combat air patrol held a thin shield over it. A warning burst through his headset. Bogies inbound from the west, range 8 miles, altitude increasing. Sargent shoved the throttle forward and felt the Wildcat surge, its squat frame shaking as it climbed. The sky ahead shimmered with the distant flash of rising sunlight. And then he saw them. A loose formation of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros sweeping in low, their wings catching the light as they arced toward the vulnerable escort ships. The Zeros moved with a predatory smoothness that always sent a pulse of pressure through his chest. Sargent tightened his harness. The canopy glass trembled as the first passing gusts from the oncoming attack washed over him. He felt the heat of his own breath inside the mask. The Wildcats formed a thin screen, but they were too few. The Zeros were closing fast, their engines a rising snarl under the wind. Sargent rolled left and prepared for the first diving pass, knowing the Wildcat could not match the Japanese fighter's acceleration or roll rate. He steadied his grip on the control stick as the closest Zero pitched downward toward him. The Wildcat shook violently as Sargent pulled into a climbing defensive turn, trying to force the Zero to commit to a high-speed run. He felt the aircraft approaching the edge of its lift, that thin moment when metal and airflow wavered between control and stall. The Zero flashed past only yards away, its guns spitting tracer fire that tore across the air where Sargent had been moments earlier. The roar of the pass rattled his ribs. He forced the Wildcat higher, letting the nose drag, letting the aircraft flirt with a near stall. Behind him, the Zero pilot corrected, banking hard and committing to a wide turn to regain position. Sargent felt the Wildcat's wings buffet again. He brought the nose down slightly, riding the trembling edge of lift, buying seconds before the next attack. Another Zero dove at him from above. The sky around him thumped with cannon bursts and the metallic hum of straining engines. The Pacific glimmered far below, the carrier now a distant gray shape on the water. Sargent exhaled slowly, eyes locked on the incoming fighter, waiting for the moment when speed and momentum would betray his enemy. The trembling edge of lift that Sargent balanced upon had not come from instinct alone. Months earlier, every pilot aboard the escort carriers, sailing through the Solomons and later the Philippines had learned that the FM-2 Wildcat could not rely on speed or modern handling to survive. The aircraft had been considered outdated from the moment it left the factory, a compact fighter designed for small decks and rugged endurance rather than cutting maneuverability. Japanese aviators flying the A6M Zero often dismissed it entirely. They believed their aircraft's superior roll rate and climb would always overwhelm the slower American fighter. Below decks on escort carriers like USS Core, USS Gambier Bay, and USS Santee, pilots studied battle reports showing disastrous losses whenever Wildcats attempted to turn horizontally with Zeros. Veteran instructors explained that a Wildcat forced into a traditional dogfight would simply be carved apart. What the FM-2 could do, however, was hold controlled slow flight far better than the Zero. Early tests had revealed that the heavier American fighter handled near stall with a predictability the Zero lacked at low speeds. The Japanese aircraft relied heavily on energy advantage and smooth airflow over its light frame. When that energy bled away, its stability degraded sharply. Pilots began to practice abrupt nose pitches, sudden throttle cuts, and lift-edge maneuvers. They learned to sense the moment the wings buffeted, but did not fully collapse. They were taught to feel the airframe rather than fight it. During training, instructors followed behind students, shouting through radios as engines groaned at the limit. Hold it. Feel the nose drop. Keep the wings alive. 1 second too long and the Wildcat would snap downward. 1 second too short and the overshoot would never happen. But when timed perfectly, the maneuver forced attackers to shoot past helplessly on the carrier decks. Crews watched as pilots rehearsed these tactics before dawn sorties. Engines warmed in the cold air while mechanics checked ammunition belts and hydraulic lines. Pilots studied the expected approach paths of Japanese raiders. They knew the enemy would come in fast and committed, counting on the first pass to cripple the defensive fighters. The Wildcat's survival depended on turning that first pass into a mistake. As the Philippine Sea campaign intensified, escort carriers faced relentless pressure from Japanese units operating out of Luzon and Formosa. Zeros attacked not only to strike the carriers, but to draw American fighters away from the vulnerable task groups. Despite their limitations, Wildcats flew constant cover, often launching with minimal fuel and maximum urgency. Pilots flew with the weight of knowing their small carriers could not outrun enemy bombers or fighters. If the cap failed, the ships below them were finished. By the time Sargent launched that December morning, the men of VC-13 had refined the stall trick tactic into a survival art. They knew how Zeros behaved during diving attacks. They understood how momentum locked Japanese pilots into straight passes. They had trained to watch for the telltale signs of an overshoot, a flash of wings too level, a nose too committed, a speed too high to pull back safely. Sargent felt those calculations rushing through him as the incoming Zero lined up its second run. The lessons from instructors, the warnings in the ready room, the bitter stories of lost pilots, all converged into one tense moment above the cold sea. His aircraft shook again under the shifting airflow. Behind him, the distant roar of the escort carrier's deck guns rolled across the sky. Zeros were not just hunting fighters. They were hunting ships. And the Wildcats were the only thing standing in their way. The incoming Zero closed rapidly, its engine tone rising until it cut through Sargent's cockpit like a taut wire. He felt the familiar rush of pressure in his chest as the fighter steadied its guns on him. Tracers cracked past his right wing, bright spears of light vanishing into the cold air behind him. Sargent eased back on the throttle, letting the Wildcat lose just enough speed to drag itself toward the stall edge. The aircraft shuddered and dipped. The nose bobbed. The wings trembled with a warning groan. But the airplane held. The Zero pilot, expecting his target to maintain speed, overshot by a margin so small that Sargent could see the glint of sunlight on the man's goggles. The Japanese fighter zipped ahead, unable to tighten its turn at that velocity. Sargent pushed the throttle forward. The Wildcat responded with a heavy surge, clawing at the sky as he rolled left to fall in behind the departing attacker. He saw the Zero's tail widen in his gun sight. His thumb pressed the firing switch. The .50 caliber guns erupted with a harsh, vibrating roar. Brass casings spilled into the rushing air below while the tracers converged on the Zero's rear fuselage. The impact tore fabric and metal from the aircraft's tail. Smoke poured from the engine as the Japanese fighter curved downward, trailing flames that rippled in the wind. Sargent watched it fall until it vanished behind a bank of low cloud near the distant horizon. He had no time to celebrate. A second Zero dove at him from high, 2 o'clock. Sargent rolled hard right, letting the Wildcat drop altitude sharply. The Zero followed, its wings slicing through the air with precision. Sergeant leveled out just above the wave tops, so low that his propeller wash carved thin lines through the surface of the sea. Salt mist streaked across his canopy. The Zero behind him retained the advantage of height, but had lost the advantage of speed. Sergeant eased the throttle back again. The Wildcat began to wobble. He felt the airframe straining to maintain lift. The Zero descended, preparing to fire. Sergeant waited, gripping the control stick tightly. He felt the buffeting intensify. The Wildcat was seconds from a stall. The Japanese pilot, committed to the attack, closed for the kill. Sergeant pulled the nose up abruptly. The world jolted. The Wildcat shot upward just long enough to force the Zero to react. The attacker, carrying more speed than it could safely manage at this altitude, shot forward past Sergeant's canopy in a blur of gray and red. The Japanese pilot tried to pull up, but the sea was too close, the maneuver too steep. The Zero's wingtip clipped the surface with a splash that sent a plume of water skyward. The aircraft tumbled into the waves and disappeared beneath the froth. Sergeant steadied his breathing. Another pair of Zeros swept toward the carrier group. Their paths were aggressive, determined. Sergeant banked toward one of them, climbing slightly to get a better position. The sky was now filled with twisting vapor trails, cannon bursts, and the distant flashes of explosions near the task group's escorts. A Wildcat from VC-13 streaked past him, chased by a Zero firing short, controlled bursts. Sergeant pressed the throttle forward, intent on intercepting. The battle unfolded below the broken clouds in a violent web of smoke and flashing steel. Wildcats dodged and weaved, pushing their airframes to their limits. Zeros sliced through the formation with practiced aggression. The air vibrated with engine noise and the crackle of gunfire. Above the chaos, Sergeant spotted another Japanese fighter rolling into a high-speed dive toward the carrier. He climbed to intercept, but the Zero reached firing range first. The carrier's gunners sent bursts of fire upward, but the attacking aircraft remained committed, diving steeply toward the deck. Sergeant pushed his engine harder. The Wildcat groaned under the strain. Just as the Zero began leveling out for its run, he executed another near-stall pitch. The maneuver slashed his forward speed. The sudden loss of velocity brought him directly behind the Zero as it committed to its run. Sergeant fired. The .50 caliber rounds tore into the Zero's left wing root. The Japanese engine coughed smoke. Flames erupted along the cowling. The attacker wavered, lost lift, and spiraled into the sea not far from the carrier's bow. The deck crew erupted into frantic motion as the crash sent a plume of water high above the rolling waves. Through the smoke and shifting sunlight, Sergeant could see more enemy formations approaching from the west. The fight was far from over, and the stall tactics that kept the Wildcats alive would be tested again before the battle waned. The widening combat zone over the Philippine Sea became a mosaic of falling debris, drifting smoke, and flashing metal. Sergeant leveled his Wildcat, scanning for the next threat. His fuel gauge trembled near the lower third. Many Wildcats during these carrier defense actions launched with only enough fuel for short patrols, relying on urgent recovery cycles to keep planes rotating through the air. The escort carriers below carried limited stores. Every pilot knew returning late or fuel miscalculations meant ditching in open water. Additional Zeros swept into the fight, splitting off in pairs and singles as they sought gaps in the American screen. The Wildcats, though slower and fewer, maintained a defensive rhythm. One flight held the mid-altitude zone, while others kept close to the carrier decks, intercepting attackers that broke through. The Japanese pilots expected their speed and climb to dominate the engagement. What they encountered instead was a disciplined web of low-speed reactions that disrupted their attack patterns. Sergeant saw it unfold as another Wildcat, flown by Ensign Gerald Knox, pulled into a steep climb against an incoming Zero. Knox held the throttle wide until the wings began to buffet. The Zero, diving with intent, expected the American plane to continue its climb and present an easy target. Instead, Knox chopped power. The Wildcat lurched into a near stall, rising only briefly before sagging. The Zero shot past, unable to correct. Knox rammed the throttle forward and swung behind the overshooting fighter. The .50 caliber fire that followed stitched across the Japanese plane's fuselage until it burst into flame. These tactics spread among escort carrier squadrons out of necessity, not innovation for prestige. Their missions were brutal. They escorted convoys, protected troop transports, and shielded supply routes. They faced not only fighters, but kamikaze attacks and mass bomber formations. The FM-2 Wildcat, rugged and forgiving at low speeds, became the unexpected backbone of these defenses. Pilots relied on the aircraft's ability to absorb punishment. Its armor protected cockpit and engine far better than the Zero's lightweight construction. On multiple occasions, Wildcats returned to their carriers riddled with holes, hydraulic fluids leaking, control wires severed, yet still intact enough for crews to haul them below deck for repair. As the fight intensified, Sargent observed another wave of Japanese aircraft descending from higher altitude. Some were Zeros. Others appeared to be Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers preparing to strike the carrier group. The Wildcats attempted to intercept, but their limited speed left only narrow engagement windows. Sargent angled upward to disrupt the dive bomber formation. He fired short bursts at the lead aircraft. Its wings smoked, wavered, and then folded. The bomber spiraled downward, crashing into the sea with a violent plume. The remaining dive bombers broke apart, losing cohesion. The Zeros tried to reinforce them, but stall trick maneuvers disrupted their escort tactics. Wildcat pilots forced overshoots, scattered the formation, and prevented the coordinated strikes that Japanese doctrine required. The chaotic sky favored the defenders. Individual duels replaced organized attack runs. Sargent's cockpit filled with the sharp smell of overheated engine oil. His temperature gauge crept dangerously high. The Wildcat was paying for every aggressive maneuver. He steadied the aircraft, letting the engine breathe. For a moment, the sky seemed quieter. Smoke trails drifted like torn gray ribbons. Fragments of metal flickered as they fell. A damaged Zero glided unsteadily past him, its pilot attempting to make it back toward distant Japanese lines. Sargent did not pursue. His priority was survival and protecting the carrier fleet below. The escort carrier group remained intact because the Wildcats had prevented the Zeros from gaining firing solutions on the decks. Even small victories in altitude and timing mattered. The Japanese pilots, trained for decisive attacks, had found themselves trapped in an exhausting pattern of overshoots and rapid repositioning. Their advantages dissolved each time they closed too quickly on a slower, stalling Wildcat. As the last organized wave of enemy fighters broke away, the Wildcats regrouped near the carrier. Deck crews prepared for emergency recoveries. Gunners on the ships scanned the sky for stragglers. The surviving Zeros retreated westward, leaving behind smoke trails that stretched across the fading morning light. Sargent exhaled for the first time in minutes. His arms tingled from the strain of holding the controls. The engine coughed as if protesting the abuse it had endured. Below him, the carrier decks shimmered with heat and exhaust. The battle had ended for now, but the larger campaign continued across the Philippines. For the Wildcats, this fight served as another proof that low-speed mastery and stall-edge tactics could overturn superior performance on paper. The quiet that settled over the carrier group felt unreal after the violence of the engagement. Sergeant brought the Wildcat into pattern, circling with the last of the returning fighters. His fuel needle hovered near empty. The deck crew below stood ready with signal paddles, awaiting each pilot's approach. The carrier rolled gently on the swells, its wake shimmering in the mid-morning sun. As he descended, Sergeant caught sight of Knox's Wildcat, limping in with one landing gear half extended. Another aircraft trailed smoke but managed to level off for its final turn. These were familiar sights on escort carrier operations. Damage was expected. Survival was the metric that mattered. The Wildcats, bruised but whole, reflected the shock their opponents had endured. Japanese pilots had treated the FM-2 as an inferior relic. Hours earlier, they had approached the task group with confidence. Now the sea behind them glimmered with the remains of their fallen comrades. Sergeant eased back on the throttle, letting the Wildcat settle toward the deck. The hook caught the third wire with a jolt that rattled his entire frame. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, deck crews rushed forward. One mechanic signaled an overheated engine. Another pointed to ruptured panels under the left wing. Sergeant opened the canopy and climbed out, shoulders aching from the constant tension. Inside the ready room, pilots trickled in one by one. Knox arrived with grease on his face and a torn flight glove. Another pilot nursed a bruised shoulder from a violent close pass. The squadron commander entered last, surveying the room. Not all seats were filled. A silence fell as the names of the missing were noted. Escort carrier aviation carried harsh costs. Small decks, limited support, continuous danger. And yet these men had held the line when larger fleet carriers were out of reach. As the after-action reports were compiled, the pattern became unmistakable. Zeros lost energy quickly during extended engagements. Their light frames reacted poorly to sudden low-speed corrections. When forced into overshoots, they became vulnerable. Japanese pilots were skilled, disciplined, and deadly. But their aircraft had limitations that aggressive tactics masked only when momentum remained in their favor. The Wildcats exploited those limitations with precision. Stall edge maneuvers, once considered risky, had allowed even outnumbered American fighters to reverse the fight. Late that afternoon, as the sun lowered behind distant cloud banks, the carrier group resumed its approach toward the next operational zone. The Philippines campaign demanded constant readiness. Reports of new Japanese air units moving south reached the task force. The pilots knew the attacks would continue in the days ahead. Their brief rest would be measured in hours. Sergeant stood on the deck, watching mechanics lift his damaged Wildcat toward the hangar below. The aircraft had carried him through another day. Beneath its rugged metal skin lay the lessons of dozens of engagements fought by men just like him. They did not rely on speed or elegance. They relied on discipline, timing, and the willingness to push their machines to the very edge of flight. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of salt and fuel across the deck. Sergeant looked toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond the fading light, more enemy formations prepared for battle. He knew the next time would demand the same resolve. The Wildcats would rise again, slow but unbreakable, turning every overshoot into a chance at survival.